Shabbat Shalom, everyone. You may be seated. I've been thinking a lot about my father recently, probably because Passover was his favorite holiday. And why wouldn't it be? My mother did all of the work. She cleaned the house, she made all of his favorite dishes while working full-time, and he got to sit at the head of the Seder and sing and tell stories. He was in his glory. That's not why I've been thinking about him so much. I've been thinking about him because my dad was one of the greatest influences in my life, even though there were moments where we didn't get along so well. I would liken it to, we danced a perfect box step, but sometimes the music played to a different rhythm, and we only knew that one dance. But when that dance and the music coincided, boy, did we have good rhythm. And the person that inspired me the most in my personal prayer was my dad. From the time I was a very young boy, my memory is when we lived in a small town in Florida, and my father would wake up in the morning, and he would sit in the same exact chair, and he would put on his tallis and his tefillin, and he would pray. No matter what his day looked like, no matter what his responsibilities, he would pray. And what was clear is he wasn't doing it for the synagogue, he wasn't doing it for a contract, he was doing it at home, for God. And that inspired me. In fact, I remember when I was 4 years old, Disney World had just opened in Florida, and our family was invited because residents of Florida were the first to enjoy Disney World. So we all went to spend 2 days in Disney World. And I was 4 years old with all my big brothers and my parents, and we're having this big vacation, and we're going to an amusement park. Could anything be more exciting for a 4-year-old? And I'm ready to go at 8 in the morning, and my father says, "Can't leave yet. I need to daven." It was the longest davening of my life at 4 years old. But sure enough, he put on tallis and tefillin, and he prayed, and then he put it away, and we got in the back of our Buick station wagon, and we drove up to Disney World, and we met Mickey Mouse. And that's the way my father's life went, until my brother died by suicide. And when my brother died by suicide, it catapulted my father into a thick, deep, and understandable depression. And every day he sat in his bathrobe in that exact same chair that he used to sit in davening, and he did nothing. I was in rabbinical school at the time my brother died, so I was fierce about my outward religion and the way in which I was going to express how it is that we should pray and the rules that we should keep. And I remember being so frustrated with my father's depression, and I snapped at him, and I said to him, "Why aren't you getting up? Why aren't you getting dressed? Why don't you daven?" And he would stare at me. And then one day, when I pushed him, he said something to me that was uncharacteristic, because while he did all of these rituals, we didn't talk much about theology. We didn't talk much about our relationship with God. We just did them. And I pushed him one particular day. I go, "Why don't you get up? Why don't you daven? Why don't you start your day? You're just sitting there. Put on tallis, put on tefillin." And he said to me with tears in his eyes, "I can't talk to God right now." And it was that sentence that impacted me more than all of the prayer that he had done previously that I had witnessed. Because what it showed me about my father in the most beautiful and blessed way is that davening for my father wasn't only an ancient ritual, it was real, it was live. It was the here and now. It wasn't something that you do by rote. It was something that had meaning, even in modernity to him. And when something so jarring in his life had happened, he had trouble connecting with God. He had been through his share of challenges. He lost his father when he was 17, his mother when he was 32, other things in his life that weren't easy. But for him, this was a moment that he couldn't forgive God for. Now, eventually, after time, he started to daven again. He started to at least put on tallis and tefillin, and I'm not sure what it was that he said to God. But I will tell you that sentence he said to me had more impact on me theologically than 6 years of rabbinical school. Because it told me that if you're going to be part of Judaism, it isn't only about what happened yesterday, it's also about today and tomorrow. And it's for that very thought that I'm going to share something very raw and very personal with all of you. If I were not a congregational rabbi, and I were not responsible for overseeing the important holiday of Passover, this year, I most likely would sit this holiday out. When I was in Israel a couple weeks ago, I met with the father of a young man who's 37 years old named Tal Shoham. He lives in the envelope of Gaza, and he was abducted by Hamas. His family, for almost 200 days, has had no proofs of life, signs of life, information about Tal's whereabouts, well-being. And his father said to us with tears in his eyes, "This year, we will not celebrate Passover in our family." And I'll tell you, when I heard those words, it gave me a jolt, but I understood it. It made total sense. And it reminded me of the line from my father. Because what Tal's father was saying is, how in the world can we have a holiday that celebrates freedom when my son is being bound and held hostage in a tunnel in darkness? We're going to eat a bread of affliction when he gets half a pita a day? How can we have this holiday when this is our reality? And there was a part of it, as jolting as it was to hear, that resonated deeply with me. And I'm struggling a lot this Passover. There's a part of me that's emblematic of a group of people I've shared these thoughts with that are about, we can't let them win. We must double down. We must have a feverish and excited and jubilant Passover Seder. Then there's a side of me that sees it like the Shoham family, that says, how can we have a holiday that celebrates freedom when we're not free? In the early 1960s, the great theologian Abraham Joshua Heschel, who mainly stuck to the idea of talking about God and connection and rarely stuck to the idea of Jewish law, made a very unique decree. Now, Heschel didn't make religious decrees often. He made imperatives. It's good for us to be socially minded and to be active, but he didn't say what was kosher, what was not. He left that to other rabbis who were Talmudists and halachists. But he made a law in 1961 that he tried to enforce. He said in 1961, it is forbidden, not kosher for Passover, for any Jew to eat cabbage or lettuce. Cabbage or lettuce, not kosher for Passover? Since when is any fruit or vegetable not kosher, period, especially for Passover? But Heschel said no, it is not kosher for Passover. And like most things Heschel did, people said, but why, Dr. Heschel? What's wrong with lettuce? What's wrong with cabbage? And he said, this is 1961, on a holiday where black people are being forced to pick this cabbage and lettuce and treated as unequal, as not the same to white people in the South, and being paid less money than white people for doing the same job, well, then that means we don't have freedom in our country. And if we're going to eat the fruits of their labor, then we can't have a holiday that celebrates freedom. You see, Heschel was passionate about equality for all of God's creations. And that's why he marched with King. And that's why he crossed the Pettus Bridge in Selma. And he felt that if we were going to be using slave labor from people who were not treated equally in the South, we couldn't eat the fruits of their toil. For Heschel, like my father, Passover was real. It wasn't just an ancient tradition that we keep no matter what. It was about realizing what happens today and then imbibing, absorbing the teaching of my father, the teaching of Heschel, I'm struggling today. I'm struggling with one part of the Seder, although there are many that I struggle with. I have a whole bunch of different questions this year. Dayenu is not saying it would have been enough, God. It's saying I've had enough, God. The bitter herbs, I don't need to have bitter herbs to feel in my stomach the way that you and many others are feeling. I don't need to think about what our ancestors must have gone through while we are going through the reality. But the part that I'm struggling with the most is the 10 plagues. Not the fact that God brought 10 plagues to the Egyptians. I'm not struggling with that. I'm struggling with our response to the 10 plagues. During the Seder, it is customary that we take out from our cup for each of the plagues, Dam, Tzvardea, Kinim, Arov, Dever, Shchin. Or if you do it like my father, he took from his wine glass and he poured out. He didn't use his finger, he poured out. And the idea behind that is a powerful metaphor. In Judaism, we say when our cup runs over, we're filled with blessing. And we're supposed to fill our cups so that they run over for the Seder. But when we pour out from our cup, it means that we're not filled with blessing. And the purpose of pouring out from our cup is that while the Egyptians were suffering, we should have empathy for them. We should feel pain for their challenge. There's a famous midrash that's told that after the Israelites crossed the Sea of Reeds and the waters came crashing down on all of the Egyptians, that Moses and Aaron and Miriam started dancing and celebrating that they had made it from slavery to freedom and they no longer were in hot pursuit from their enemies. And as they're dancing and singing, enjoying life and the blessings that were bestowed upon them, the Midrash says they called up to God and said, God, come dance with us. We're celebrating. And God said, how in the world can I celebrate when my creations, the Egyptians, were just destroyed? God is telling us that we should not revel in the pain of others, even if they are our enemies. So I'm struggling with that this year because it reminds me of how it is that we hold a delicate balance that's frankly quite hard to hold right now. After Osama bin Laden was found and killed and the news leaked to America, there were throngs of people outside of Ground Zero, outside of the Pentagon and the White House that began singing and dancing and drinking as if it were New Year's or the 4th of July. And I was disgusted by their show of patriotism. Yes, of course, we can take some level of comfort in knowing that those evil adversaries that seek to do harm to us are no longer a threat. But is that reason to celebrate? Is that reason for joy? I've spent years doing extensive research and haven't found one lick of data that has shown anywhere in Israel or America that after Eichmann was captured, tried, and sentenced to hanging in Israel, where there were celebrations as a result. Daily, we get information of leading generals from Hamas or Hezbollah who've been taken out by the IDF. And when I hear that news, I don't pop a candy. I don't give my kids licorice. I don't celebrate and pass it on through email to everyone and tell them to have a l'chaim. I take a necessary sigh and say it was needed, but it's not something I celebrate. But today, right now, if you're asking me to have empathy for Hamas, my enemy that has done what it's done to my people and to our nation and recalibrated us for the next 100 to 500 years, I don't want to pour out from my cup for them. I'm not ready to pour out from my cup for them. I'm not ready to wipe a tear for them. I'm not ready to feel that feeling. In fact, if you want to ask what resonates with me more, it's a piece from the Haggadah that's found just later, right before Elijah the prophet comes in, where we say the words, Shvo Chamatcha, God, take out your wrath and literally pour it on our enemies, which is in perfect contradiction to the 10 plagues. Later in the Haggadah, we tell God we have enemies and we want you to take out the anger you have towards our enemies. That's what we want from you, God. Get them. And we've always bristled from that text. It's never been one that we've done a deep dive on. But this year, that text is talking to me more than ever. Because I, perhaps should be embarrassed by saying it, but I want God to pour out God's wrath on our enemies, whether they be in Iran or in Syria or in Lebanon or in the Gaza Strip, whether it be the Houthis or Hamas or Hezbollah. I want our enemies to know not to threaten us again. And I have no interest in pouring out from my cup. And I'm struggling deeply with the idea of freedom this year and a holiday that commemorates it. I'm thinking a lot about what my father would do if I could unpeel that onion and get to him and say, what do we do this year, Dad? Do we not celebrate? Do we forgo? Do we do it in spite of it, harder? What should Passover be this year for all of us? This idea of holding these two realities is not new. In fact, I think it surrounds us. But a trap that you and I and all of us have fallen into lately is a trap that we have to do one or the other. A trap that to be live in the moment, to feel the feelings of what we're feeling today, we should just sit this Passover out. Or the trap of feeling, nope, we have to go deeper and harder and double down on this Passover. We have this idea that what happened at Columbia University this week is either the greatest travesty and modernity to happen to the Jews, or perhaps the most redemptive moment. Because I'm sure that there's a significant portion of this temple that will say, the amount of professors and students and the vitriol that was shared, celebrating October 7th, claiming there would be more, asking for salvation for the Palestinians and no release of hostages or freedom or the right to survive for Jews on a college campus in America where thousands had gathered to be with the same cause is a source of national shame. To see anti-Semitism demonstrated, paraded in a way that people were unapologetic, proud to be against Jews, causes all of us to shudder and have fear. And then at the same time, for those who bothered to watch the end of the movie, you saw 5 buses brought by the NYPD that were all loaded with students and professors and people who weren't even connected to the university, handcuffed, put on the bus and processed, that will go on a permanent record for inciting violence and hatred and spewing hate speech. So what is it? Do we celebrate a government that has our back, an NYPD that's protecting us? Or do we lament the fact that people are unabashedly wagging a finger telling us that October 7th is going to happen over and over, and people proudly becoming a part of Hamas? People chanting on camera, "We are Hamas." I haven't ever used a seance, and I don't know how to, although I wish I could. It'd be an interesting list of people that I call back. But when I have that imaginary conversation with my dad, and I'm getting the best of him where we're in that rhythm, the music's playing perfect to our dance step, I imagine him saying in a very loving and paternal way, "David, you can do both. You can have a Seder this year. You should sit down and eat matzah and drink wine and taste the bitter herbs. But the Seder can also be markedly different. It can notice and acknowledge and represent the reality of where we are, the pain that we feel, the captives and those that are denied freedom that must be core to what it is we share and talk about. You don't have to have one or the other. You can have both. No differently than pouring out from our cup for the 10 plagues, and no differently than reciting the word Shvo Chamatcha, God, take your wrath out on our enemies. Our life, and this holiday in particular, is about finding that balance. And lately, I feel like our society has been off our equilibrium, but for good reason. These moments have jarred us in a way that takes us off of our equilibrium. So I close on this Shabbat HaGadol, this great Shabbat, with these tough lessons and with this confusion, with a prayer for you and a prayer for me and a prayer for all of us. Yehi ratzon milfanecha Adonai Eloheinu ve'Elohei avotenu. May it be your will, Adonai, our God and God of our ancestors, that as we enter this holiday of Passover in just a few days, may we be able to find the most sacred and important form of balance in our lives. A balance that remembers our pain of yesteryear and that recalls our pain of today, but a balance that also can celebrate the freedoms that we have been gifted and the voices that we have to share that freedom. A balance that reminds us that we can take relief in knowing our enemies are gone when indeed they are removed from the world, but a balance that reminds us that it's never something we celebrate or gloat in, because they too are God's creations, although their choices have brought them wayward. A balance, O God, that allows us to pour out from our cup with empathy, but reminds us that we can still seek to remove those who want to do us harm. May we find that balance between our work and our lives, our family and our friends, you, O God, and the world that we live in. May that balance lead us closer to you and closer to one another. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may that be God's will. And let us say, Amen.